This is the Edge of Excellence, empowering people to shape the future. Let's inspire, innovate, and explore together. I'm Jessica Ford, and today we're talking about something that has shaped modern technology organizations, DevOps, and where it's headed next.
And I'm Brian Beilman, and joining us today is Kevin Eberman, a leader in information security, cloud operations, and compliance, and DevSecOps expert. With deep experience across security, governance, cloud platforms, networking, and highly available systems. So Kevin and I have worked together previously, and one of the things that stood out to me was how he brought DevOps thinking into the organization, not just as a technical shift, but as a leadership and operational evolution. Kevin has a proven ability, and which you will see a genuine enthusiasm for talking about IT and security in a meaningful way. Kevin, welcome to the Edge of Excellence.
Awesome. Delighted to be here.
Yes, Kevin, welcome. And before we get into today's topic, I'd love if you could walk us through your background and just sort of the journey that's led you to where you are today.
I'll try to keep it short because it's a long story. But I will say that I started my career in San Francisco working for a software company called WebLogic. WebLogic was ultimately acquired by BEA, and BEA was acquired by Oracle, and that product, the WebLogic application server, which was really the first Java J2EE application that was successful in the market, has had a long shadow. And the reason why I'm drilling into that is because the software developers at that company were incredibly good. And they were doing a lot of things that we now refer to as DevOps or Agile in the mid-90s, like 1996, 97. And so at that point, they were doing automated builds, unit testing, system integration testing, in an automated fashion, and as well as in terms of work and how they defined and managed work, it was all based on agile principles and focusing on what is the least we can do that is effective and useful. And all of these guys were super duper good at it, and really set the model for me for how to interact with development teams and how good development teams work, and and taking those principles into operations. So over time, and when DevOps actually sort of hit the scene as a word, which was about 12, 15 years ago already, right before I started working with Brian, for me, it really crystallized what needed to happen, and that dev and ops were two sides of the same coin. And but the history of all of it really goes back a lot further. But that's how I got into it. That's how that's where sort of my impression was created, and have taken those principles to a lot of different companies to push them forward with respect to the maturity of their automation, as well as the observability of their environment.
No, that's great. And I appreciate you sharing that background of how you've gotten here today. And you started touching on this. I'm going to dive back into it. You've mentioned that the intellectual framework of DevOps is actually much older. So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah. So it was only just recently that I read a really fabulous book called The Phoenix Project, which is a fictionalized account of a VP of operations that's sort of thrown under the bus of a project that's gone completely out of control. That's the Phoenix.
No.
And what he has to do to sort of get himself out from underneath it all, and it's really about implementing DevOps within an enterprise, and in the course of the discussion about that, they talk about manufacturing and how efficiently or how modern manufacturing organizations and plants were designed to limit bottlenecks, identify constraints, and manage the overall output of the factory. And that goes back to yet another book that was popular in the 70s called The Goal, which is really actually the better book of the two, also a fictionalized account, but taking on manufacturing in the 70s and problems that manufacturing companies had with excessive inventory within their factories, inability to get orders out quickly. And fundamentally, all of it is about managing work effectively and focusing on what matters, which is the goal. And what's the goal? To be profitable. So how do you get there? You're efficient. And so this same principles, going back from the 70s all the way through to what we're doing today, it's about managing work and less about technology and tools.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when we chatted before, this recording, you had used an example of the Toyota production system. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, this concept of it really boils down to a very specific concept about output and managing throughput. So everybody has always measured the productivity of their systems and their environment, their manufacturing environment. And the mistake that people made was maximizing the efficiency of every workstation, which actually creates bottlenecks because not every workstation is moving at the same speed, and so you wind up piling up work in front of some workstations and starving other workstations for work, and so it's a detriment to your overall output to maximize the efficiency of each individual station. And what you want to do is maximize the output of the entire system. And that's what Toyota did, right? And so they got really good at, getting good cars out of the system. And let me give you a specific example. So, and this speaks to like QA and DevOps and early testing. So, they would build a component for the car that was comprised of a whole bunch of different parts, and then they would test it. And if the part failed, right, then they have to sort of rebuild all of those components and put it all together. But when they looked at it, they realized that all of the failures sort of broke down to two different parts within this thing that they were building. And so instead of building it first and then testing it, they tested the parts that typically fail. And so in that way, they identified the problems before they had built something that was useless. And it's really that same methodology over and over in an iterative fashion that gets you Toyota cars in the 70s that I remember that were, that were little tanks, right? That they were excellent cars and really inexpensive. And that's where you want to be.
Well, that makes me think. Thinking back to when I grew up and I had American cars, and in my trunk I carried an extra quart of oil, extra tools, and everything, because just in case it broke down. But when Toyota started, in that era, I started bringing out cars that were like much more reliable than a typical car, right? And so, how does that? I mean, let's step forward a little bit. And how does this concept kind of connect to modern DevOps thinking? How does that relate, I think?
Yeah. So it really comes from what I sort of Agile and Scrum and those methodologies for identifying and prioritizing work, and breaking things down into smaller, doable, and useful chunks. And fundamentally, that's what we're doing, right? In terms of our Jira storyboards, Kanbans, and Kanban and to connect words that we use today back to the Toyota production system is a Japanese word for card. And that's how they decided, they literally put cards up next to workstations to identify which orders they would work on next. And you can only do one thing at a time. So they only had one thing in the production queue and everything else in the backlog. And so it mirrors exactly how we're doing things today, down to the words we're using.
Oh, that's cool. I know I've learned a fun fact for today. So thank you for that, Kevin. So a lot of what you're talking about are some really strong ideas. And, change is hard for people. It's certainly hard for organizations. So why do you think that even strong ideas can take so long to be absorbed into how these organizations are actually operating?
Yeah, and so this is not just a DevOps problem and a modern problem of adapting these kinds of ideas. While Toyota was very successful with their process, not other car manufacturers tried and failed to implement DevOps, and it's so because it's actually hard. Transformation and
Yeah.
change is actually hard, and there's incredible pressure to meet your immediate goals and objectives that undermine your ability to make structural and systemic changes.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And when I think about, how fast things are changing now, I think this is going to be just a continuing problem that organizations are going to be having to look at and face. And when we chatted originally, we started talking about DevOps and then we kind of moved into this conversation about DevSecOps. So I'd love to kind of shift focus to that a little bit and ask you, at what point do you feel security became impossible to treat as something separate from operations?
So it's an interesting question. And I'm not sure the premise of it is completely true,
Okay.
because in a lot of smaller organizations that can't afford a dedicated security function, ops is doing security alongside with keeping the wheels on the bus. Now, it's typically as organizations get larger that they implement a dedicated security function. Um, and in those large organizations, it has the same problem that dev had with ops, which is that they were unaligned and working towards different goals. And I tend to think of SEC as being much more closely aligned with ops in terms of keeping the wheels on the bus, providing guardrails, and it's more operational. And often at times at odds with dev, and so in so much as dev and ops need to be working together, dev sec and ops really need to be working together, and like a lot of other things get thrown into that dev ops formulation too, like dev QA ops, it gets because people realize that you cannot separate these things; they're a part of a whole.
It makes me think a little bit about, some of the areas when I think of DevOps at scale, I think of companies like Facebook, for example, who were like just moving fast, breaking things, and it wasn't like, it used to be like, okay, we have a release on Friday, and everybody's got to get together on a Friday night. We're going to do this big, very monolithic step by step, and then it became a little more automated, and there's companies that really were able to scale, were able to do this really well. And you mentioned this. There's also a little bit of conflict sometimes between maybe dev and sec, because sometimes you want to move fast, but you don't want to open security vulnerabilities, and you got to make sure that they're all very tightly together. And so can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really hard. Ultimately, dev teams are driven by the business to sell product, and features engage customers and help them make decisions to buy products. Um, and so like there's an implicit need for operations and security, but but not necessarily a conscious or top of mind need for that, and particularly when you're thinking about what people call a minimally viable product, there's a real motivation to skip whatever that whatever can not be done, and often that means resiliency, often that means security, often that means stability.
Now, Kevin, in our previous conversation, I remember you speaking to this idea that, people had once predicted DevOps would lead to no ops. Can you speak to that a little bit and why you think that didn't end up happening?
Yeah, and I think it speaks also to like the tension between developers and operations, and that developers, not all developers, but that they would prefer not to have ops at all, and in so much as they're making products and driving businesses, they like to have things under their control. And so,
Right.
in so much as DevOps was being implemented with automation, code, and scripting, and software, it lowered the bar for what developers could do themselves. And so there were tasks and things that developers can now do without relying on ops, and that particularly in smaller environments, you probably didn't need a dedicated ops person in the same way. But the fact of the matter is that ultimately dev is what you're putting inside the box, so to speak, and ops is how the box connects to the rest of the world, and that requires sort of eyeballs on two different things, and you really can't get rid of ops. So the irony of it all is now, as we are entering into this AI world, and automated coding is becoming a real thing, that we're actually getting a place where it's actually no dev, and it's only ops, and that's not true either, right? Because in the same fashion, the automation and the technology lowers the bar for people that are not software developers to develop software. When you think about vibe coding, that's exactly what's happening. And that ultimately doesn't mean that we eliminate software development or even people that know, software languages like Python or C++, but that specialized knowledge is going to be more focused in specific places, and that the bar is lowered for anybody to do some kind of coding.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit, give Kevin some props for when we were working together at this company. He came in, and we were consulting, and it was introducing DevOps into this function, and there was a natural conflict really between development would push something out, and then if it failed in operations, then operations would get woke up at the 3 o'clock in the morning. So was this broken? And you got to, and then you try to bring developers into it, and they didn't have as much ownership in that, and I think what this paradigm helped was that there's mutual ownership in this, that by the time it gets out to the world, and we're not, we're all going to sleep at night because it went through some processes. It went through build, test, deploy, and different, QA and dev, and went through a bunch of really great processes, which I think that it helps. I think it helped the relationship across the organization, as well as overall give a better product, better experience for the customer. So yeah, you're making more money because it's more reliable, it's better. So I think that mindset is not always apparent, but you certainly brought it to the place we work together. So
Yeah, I'll add two things here. One about standardization, and one about who gets, a pager. And when there were chronic outages for every deployment of one of the applications we were managed, I finally said to the lead developer, you're now on call. We're tired of waking up to fix your thing. And, like, it's just too much, like, you have to do better. And setting some real expectations for quality. And I'll tell you, like, developers don't like that, right? They don't actually want to be up in the middle of the night fixing their broken code. And that certainly made a shift in that particular application that was perpetually having problems. And then the other thing that was interesting about where we worked together was that there was a lot of infrastructure that was already there when I got there, and it was actually consolidated from a number of different groups and teams, and which seems like efficiency, and to some extent it is. But the reality is that each of those groups and teams had built their own little cottage industry of a tech stack. And so we had Linux tech stacks, we had Unix tech stacks, we had Windows tech stacks, we had different versions of these things. Everything was heterogeneous. It was incredibly difficult to update and patch anything, and it was just hard. And the biggest thing that we started to work on, out of the box, was server configuration management, so that we knew what tools were on what systems and had automated abilities to update and manage them. And ultimately, we converted much of that tech stack onto Linux VMs running on VMware, on homogeneous systems with homogeneous operating systems, and the same tools on those boxes, so that now we go from it takes weeks and a lot of fingers crossing that we don't blow things up when we update the operating system, because daylight savings time has changed, and you need to install a new time package and reboot every computer on your network, and you have no idea what's actually going to come back up or blow up because it's just so old. So that homogenization and standardization was huge where we worked together.
No, absolutely. Now, Kevin, you've talked about GovOps as the next evolution. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so GovOps, not government ops, to be clear.
That's what I thought. I'll be honest, I'm not a technical person, but that is where my mind went.
Yeah, but governance operations. And maybe this reflects some of my own career trajectory in terms of ops to information security to governance. But notwithstanding my biases, what's happening with the automation, and we're talking about this already, is like lowering the bar for people that are not software developers traditionally to do software development, and the AI itself, like the automation is becoming so much more important, and especially when you think of agents. And so what that really means in my own mind is that the prompt is becoming more and more important, because those prompts are going to run agents that are going to do things over a course of period of time. And so those prompts have to be very well written. And fundamentally, the way I think about those prompts is the infrastructure of your governance program. And it is the breakdown of policies and standards directly into prompts that will run your business. And so it is in the articulation of your governance policy and standards, which will then actually run your business without the need for large software development teams and operations teams that you get from DevSecOps to GovOps, where you're really obscuring Dev and Sec and focusing on the business needs and governance.
That's one thing that's important you said there is, I think, because we have customers who have regulatory compliance and essentially governance, those are typically more powerful business drivers than just make it secure. And we don't want to get hacked. It's more like we need to be meet this regulatory requirement, and I need to know for sure. And then when an audit comes, I need to be able to very clearly articulate that we are meeting these or not, or whatever it may be. But it has to be really easy. And so, I mean, I guess the good thing about thinking about it in this way is that because there are clear business drivers that a business can get behind, and it's not just technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what the automation is also doing is traditionally audits were very labor intensive things. You needed from the auditor specialized knowledge and understanding of how to do an IT audit that requires certification and training. And then the process of the audit typically involved a lot of manual steps, like gather a sample of information systems and provide these particular outputs that we want to inspect. Now that things are been automated with respect to DevOps, DevSecOps, and automated CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, we now have the ability to hook in our compliance controls and our observability directly into these platforms. And so we're sort of leapfrogging the need to have a dedicated auditor and a dedicated team servicing audits, because the outputs and reports can be baked into the DevOps flow directly.
Now, you're mentioning prompts and AI, and we're talking a lot about automations. Can you speak a little bit to how AI is changing operational workflows in like AWS and Azure environments?
Yeah, so all of these things that we're talking about are getting baked into these cloud service providers, so that if you and it's not there yet, right? But this is where it's going. So right. You say like, our environment needs to be PCI certified, and it spits out a list of controls that you need to implement or test the controls that you have to see if they're that you're compliant. And that's removing a lot of work that used to happen manually.
Yeah, and that's huge. I'm curious, do you think AI reduces risk at all, or is it just shifting where the risk lives?
Well, there's a truism about a lot of things that says, if you make one thing better, you're making something else worse. Or if you solve one problem, you create a new problem. If you mitigate one risk, you create a new risk. And that's 1,000% true with AI, and it's a little like Pandora's box, right? It's capable of doing amazing things, fabulous things beyond our imagination, but it also, releases all the suffering and curses of the world. So, like tread carefully. And frankly, because the tools are so advanced and complicated, it's what pushing the automation into governance and the need to operate from a governance standpoint and sort of articulating why I think GovOps is where the juice is going to be for the next while.
Well, and I've seen some on this note. I think about some of the watching the development process for some of the things where our people use AI and having these series of checks. So I think if you think about it and you really, I think you can become a coder, or you can write code as AI without knowing anything about Python or whatever, but it does take that systems thinking of saying, well, I'm going to do this, and I want to make sure this check, this, you can go through a series, and AI will help you do that much faster but you got to know to put these in place, right? Okay. And you got to make sure that AI is not lying to you, and you got to make sure that all of these factors go along there and check and double check. But you can put these framework checks and these compliance checks in easier, but you still have to, that's where a kind of maybe an experienced person who thought about it going, okay, let's put this in place, instead of just saying, write me some cool code, so.
Yeah, right. And even before AI, people often wrote bad code, that barely worked and was insecure. And they were software developers. And so now you have people that have no training, getting in there and doing things. And you're absolutely, and it's fundamentally the same truism that we all know, like garbage in, garbage out. And it takes more than just vibes to make good software, and it does really take an understanding of these kinds of frameworks to make them work well.
Now, how do you think AI and these automations are impacting the expectations that are placed on developers and operations leaders?
So I think it's a huge shift. And I would describe it, is even though AI is here and people are interacting it, we're still in the pre-AI world. Some people are living in the future, but most of us are not. And the impacts and changes that this is going to bring about are going to be huge. That's my expectation. And there are a few examples that I can give you that people are like, wow, this changes everything. One of them was in the film industry, where there's this Keanu Reeves and Tom Cruise fighting it out, and it's all AI generated. It's incredibly well done. It's funny. It's cute. It was like, and the person was a director, and he's like, this is the end. This is the beginning of the end. And then Atlassian recently announced that they let go of 4,000 people within their company because of AI. Now, there's a lot of AI washing of bad performance and issues within companies, but fundamentally, I think what's happening is true, and it's going to happen more and faster.
Yeah, my husband is a videographer, and he's, had some concerns about what you're speaking to as well. So with all these changes, that you're talking about, what skills then become more critical?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, one of the things that in the market right now, there's a lot of interest in tools. Do you know how to use this tool? Are you familiar with this tool? We need to plug in somebody who's really deep in this tool in order for them to be productive. My understanding, the half-life of usability of tools now is 2.5 years. So, what are you learning? How quickly? And when is it not going to be useful anymore? And on that kind of cycle, ultimately you can't keep up. And frankly, when it comes back down to, and we were just talking about this in terms of what makes a good software developer in this world, and there's an understanding of how things are supposed to work, but I also think the most important thing is critical thinking. So, is my AI lying to me? Is it just shining me on and making stuff up or not?
Right.
Hugely important. Yeah. So that's and those are people skills, and sort of attributes of humans, and I think those are going to be more and more important. You can't sort of jargon your way through being a subject matter expert at a specific tool or technology. You actually have to be a critical thinker.
Yeah, that makes me think too a little bit about I think about culture quite a bit, and all of these changes that come about, as people, and as way companies. You talked about Atlassian, probably thinking about, well, we can do more with less or whatever. But I do think that any leader, and I struggle with this myself. I'm Jess may be able to relate to this, but I'm part of this RevOps team, and we're moving forward on a new initiative, and I have to stop myself to it's always like, this is the way we've always done it, or should we do it this way? People come up with new ideas, and I'm like, I got to pause, because even I feel like I'm a forward thinker. it's hard for all us to get out of our own way sometimes. And I think that, the skills that we all need to think about, I think the critical thinking is right on, Kevin, because like that's a really valuable skill. It applies to everything, looking at the future, looking at, it applies to any aspect of what people are doing. And then just to dial back a little bit, what you're talking about, making sure that AI is not lying to you. We have a podcast that just released with Justin, one of our people, and he was just talking about his battles that he's been trying to develop this app, and when Claude just keeps lying to him all the time, and just wants to please him, and he's like, I don't want you to please me, I want you to give me the right answer, So if you just don't think about that, you're going to get some stuff down the road that's not doing what you think. So all of these, it causes our brain, we have to just do things differently.
Yeah, and let's take it a step further, like in terms of dangers of AI. AI psychosis, where like you're just so wrapped up and involved in your AI and your relationship with your AI that you're not thinking straight anymore. And so, like we're all sort of going through this experiment in human behavior in real time.
Yeah, no, it's wild, and it's amazing how it's impacting those of us as adults. I am just so curious, the impact it will have on the younger generation that won't know a world without AI. So
right.
It's interesting to see, how things, progress with this new world, as you will.
But I do want to jump in. We do survive things. Like I was told when I was a kid that my brain would rot if I kept playing video games. I kept playing video games. I didn't care. I love video games. I still do. So we all have a tendency to over dramatize our own situation, but we all tend to muddle our way through in some fashion.
No, that's so true. That's so true.
I want to get us back on a different topic, because there's something that you're very passionate about and that we've spoke about, and you wrote a blog and we worked on this together about basically risk and security. And so, talking about you did a lot of research on risk scoring with models like Qualys True Risk, and so I wanted to make sure we cover this, because I want to find out what kind of questions did this raise for you, and how do we, around this.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up, and it's a very interesting topic. I'm gonna set the stage a little bit when we talk about vulnerability management, and usually what that means is that we get these reports, these CVEs that indicate, there's some indication of compromise or vulnerability within some piece of software, and they'll give you some idea of how severe that vulnerability is, and then we go back and patch systems to eliminate those vulnerabilities. The problem is that there's so many vulnerabilities, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that have been identified, and that in really large environments, and you think of a company like a Staples, where they might have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices under their management. If they're reacting to everything that's quote unquote, a CVSS score of 10, the highest criticality, they may not, like that's a huge work effort to patch all those systems. And so really what you want to do is, instead of patching things based upon the severity of the threat, you want to patch based on the actual risk to your environment and to your, what you're trying to do. And so in that way, you could say like, well, we have two systems with the same critical vulnerability. One of them is serving up peanuts in the cafeteria, like a little like peanut vending machine, but it's connected to the internet, and the other is running our Oracle database. And so I think there's pretty clear, which one you should patch first, and expand that same idea to hundreds of thousands of systems, and risk-based vulnerability management becomes a huge benefit to prioritize and focus and to limit the amount of work it takes to mitigate the risk of critical vulnerabilities. And a lot of and so vendors like Qualys are moving away from just scoring vulnerabilities and the threat based upon the vulnerability, but marrying that to the likelihood and the impact that would actually have, and generating a risk score. And with the risk score, that guides you to how to how to prioritize your teams to do patching. And the problem is like all this stuff is complicated, and Qualys, to their credit, publishes their formula, but looking at it at face value, it's hard to understand how exactly does it score. And it's when I was introduced to this that I was like, I can't figure it out. And I started to test, different scenarios. Like, if there's this vulnerability on this system, what is the risk score? And that's when things got really interesting and problematic because I was looking at Qualys Enterprise Threat Management, which is a new product that Qualys has been pushing out in the last year or two, which is meant to give senior executives a view into their risk posture throughout the organization, and to do this risk-based vulnerability management at scale and for the benefit of senior executive leaders. The problem is that the formula that uses it seems to be out of whack, and that for systems that have a lot of critical vulnerabilities and threats, and that are your most sensitive, important, and exposed to the internet, it takes what I would consider too many vulnerabilities to put it into the critical threshold. And then it turns out that in another product, their vulnerability management detection and response product, which is sort of their bread and butter baseline, sort of, what made Qualys, the same true risk calculation, and that's TRURISKTM, true risk, Qualys True Risk, scores the same system with the same vulnerabilities differently and much more aggressively. And so, like, okay, Qualys, what's up? Is it the rosy picture for the executives, or is it the grim picture for your patching teams? And it turns out that Qualys has two versions of the true risk formula. One that was their sort of legacy one that's on VMDR and scores risk more aggressively, and another one that is for their ETM project. And it's like, that's just a mess. And not clearly visible, not transparent, that this drift between the scoring happened from version 1 to version 2. Because the primary benefit in what they sell with that product, with ETM, is prioritization. And so in so much as that there are ranked scores, everything looks great, it functionally is working. And it's like the old joke, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And it's like, but like, we're going to need to do some work on coalescing these things. There was other changes that they made too that were important and meaningful, but this regression in terms of the output is pretty significant. Not a good look.
I'll also say that for our listeners, we'll have Kevin's credentials in his blog and various things about him, in the show notes later on. So you want to dig deeper into this true risk and even reach out to Kevin about this, because he's done a lot of research in this area, and I think it's important to businesses to really be able to rely on these type of these true risk scores and things like that. So just
100%.
Yeah.
And it goes back to like critical thinking, do you accept at face value that it's transparent because they showed me the formula? I did it. And then lo and behold, like there's some real significant problems. And that really goes back to like pushing security left, pushing it into the design phase, and security becoming more like governance. And that at design time, you need to be thinking about the negative implications of what you're doing and putting controls in as soon as possible. And way before we typically think about it these days.
Right. And Kevin, I'm curious, is there any advice that you would give a CIO or a security leader that's navigating some of the transitions that we've chatted about today?
I think that everybody is grappling with AI in
Mm-hmm.
some fashion or another, and everybody recognizes that they're on a journey, and that and that I'll take it back to a DevOps thing. Break it down into small chunks, break it down
Yeah.
into manageable bits of work that gives you incremental improvement and benefit, and generate a waterfall so that at some point all these little improvements that you're making make a substantial change in how you operate and how effective you are. Now, I think that I've seen this at a number of different places. The worst thing you can do is try to build the end. Is trying to implement where you expect to be, because you wind up tripping over your own feet and you never get there.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Brian, before I ask my final, more fun question to Kevin, is there anything that you would like to ask?
I think no. I think we covered a lot, and I think although when we first thought of what would this whole thing be about, I think the theme throughout the whole thing is critical thinking,
Yes.
and breaking things down in ways that it makes sense. Whether it's DevOps, DevSecOps, GovOps, AI, this whole, and I think, and sometimes just got to pause and really think about these things because we're moving so quickly all the time. We just move to the next thing, and just pause, and often the answer is right there. But that's kind of the thread throughout this whole conversation that I've picked up amidst all this really awesome information. So
I think that's a great point. And sometimes like that's a real challenge, right? Because we're moving very quickly. We need to move quickly. Our minds are built to move quickly. But sometimes maybe you should pause before you hit the send button,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for all of us and for so many different aspects of life.
Exactly.
So, Kevin, we like to wrap our guest's first episode with us with a question to see if there's a fun fact about you that might surprise people that you could share with our audience.
Yes. I was prepared for this. Came with a prop. So this. I don't know if you can see it, but this is my trumpet.
That's amazing.
I'm a trumpet player. I play in a band, and I picked it up during COVID. Or picked it back up during COVID. I was a trumpet player when I was in middle school. And so that's been a really fun thing, a fun journey. It's keeping me really busy and humble because it's really hard to play good music.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
That's awesome.
Do you play out with your band?
Yes, we do.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, maybe we'll have to include your band schedule in our show notes. People can go down to the Providence area and check out your shows.
For sure.
Cool. That's awesome. So Kevin, this has been such a thoughtful conversation. And we wanted to have you on here because when you and I speak, we always have these types of conversations. I know there's listeners out there who are going to want to continue it with you directly. So if someone wants to connect, follow your network and engage with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I think the easiest way is to message me on LinkedIn, which I track, and I'll get back to you. I would love to hear from anybody who has questions or interest in anything.
Cool. Yeah, we'll include your LinkedIn profile on the show notes, and so people will find that.
Today's conversation reminded us that DevOps isn't about speed alone. It's about designing how work happens. And as automation and AI continue to reshape operations, governance, visibility, and critical thinking are foundational. If you'd like to learn more about how Iuvo helps organizations turn technology into real business outcomes, you can visit iuvotech.com. You'll also find this episode and every other conversation from Edge of Excellence there.
And DevOps, DevSecOps, and GovOps aren't just evolving technical models. They're reflections of organizational maturity. As the leaders who embrace that evolution will be the ones who scale confidently and responsibly. And thank you for listening. And until next time, stay curious.
Thank you for tuning in to the Edge of Excellence. We hope today's insights empower you to shape your future and rise to your full potential. Let's continue to grow, innovate, and lead, pushing the boundaries of excellence.